In Harriet Jacobs' Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, Jacobs tells the autobiographical story of her miseries as a mistreated slave woman in the pre-Civil War South. While Jacobs' status as a black slave offers insights to the conditions of slaves throughout the South, an equally interesting relationship is that between Jacobs and the contemporary idea of a true woman. It is evident that Jacobs feels the impact of being a woman just as much as he suffers from being a slave in this time period, as being a woman made being a slave that much more difficult. Because of the negative effect that true womanhood has had on Harriet Jacobs' life, she rejects the notion of a true woman and redefines womanhood to garner solidarity with Northern women. In the events described in Incidents, true womanhood has hurt Jacobs because of its promotion of ideals that Jacobs can't uphold due to her position as a slave. According to Jennifer Larson, the cult of true womanhood calls for purity, piety, domesticity, and submissiveness. These traits were believed to make women qualify as true women. Purity has had arguably the most impact on Jacobs' life as a slave and her devaluation as a human being. Women in the 19th century were expected to be sexually reserved, an ideal that could not be kept by the slave women. Because of their status as property, slave women's sexual boundaries did not need to be respected by their slave masters. Thus, they were often sexually abused by their male masters, an occurrence that left them sexually impure against their will. Such is the case with Harriet Jacobs, as Dr. Flint took advantage of Jacobs when she was owned by Dr. Flint's daughter. The damage done to Jacobs was twofold. She became the object of Dr. Flint's wife's jealousy and thus lost all sympathy for her, and lost respect for her sexual choice. As Patricia Hopkins explains, the sexual affairs between slave woman and master substantiates the fears of white women who felt their husbands were being ensnared or entrapped by the sexual appetites of their enslaved females. Because of this jealous fear that manifests itself in Dr. Flint's wife, Jacobs no longer has any support that Miss Flint might have given her. Additionally, Jacob's slavery prevented her from having a healthy relationship with religion. Slave churches were heavily restricted by white slaveholders, and at times, during fear of slave rebellion, slaves weren't allowed to congregate at all. According to Jacobs, the slaves begged the privilege of again meeting in the little church, and their request was denied, and the church was demolished. Also, religion was used as another means of oppressing slaves, and slave masters often purported to be righteous while using religion as an excuse to be cruel to their slaves. Jacobs contrasts this by describing the religion of a kind slave owner, saying that her religion was not a garb put up for Sunday, like most other slave masters' religions were. Because of her inability to fulfill a significant portion of the archetype of a true woman, Jacobs and many others in her position were not valued as feminine. As the definition of a true woman did not fit Jacobs because of her status as a slave, she sought to change how womanhood was viewed. In order to give credibility to the femininity of black slave women, Jacob defines her own paragon of femininity as not one of piety, domesticity, submissiveness, and purity, but one of virtue and free agency. Jacobs initially builds the model of what a woman should be by describing her mother in a positive light, calling her a remarkable woman in many respects. Jacobs highlights her grandmother's self-determination when she purchases her own freedom and demonstrates the way she values honesty, respect, and supporting loved ones. She's a valuable member of the community who looks after her children and grandchildren and is sought after for advice from Jacobs. Later on in the story, Jacobs makes decisions that demonstrate the values she learned from her grandmother. She tries to do what is best for the well-being and freedom of her children and actively takes steps to ensure her freedom. Often her goals are at odds with the conceived definition of a true woman. She declines the opportunity to be submissive when she objected to having her freedom bought from Mr. Flint and his family, demonstrating that she values her own personhood over being submissive. Also, Jacobs engages in a sexual relationship with Mr. Sands in hopes of one day using him as an escape from the bonds of slavery. Here she denies the supposedly feminine virtue of submissiveness and is instead validating the idea that women must be active doers that take steps to help themselves and those they love, even if it means defying womanhood. In her appeals to the women of the North, Jacobs condemns the passive role women are playing in the oppressive system that degrades both women and slaves. In defining womanhood to be about action and virtue, Jacobs includes all slave women in the definition of womanhood, when they were once not considered women at all, but animals. This puts them on equal ground with white women of the North. In redefining womanhood and rejecting the notions of the cult of true womanhood, Jacob hopes to inspire women of the North to take action against the system of slavery. Jacobs uses her new definition of womanhood in two ways. First, she makes women of the North realize that she, as well as all the other slave women, are actual women, just like the target audience. People in the North often had ill-conceived notions about what slaves were. Slaves were savage and subhuman in their eyes, even if they had never held slaves themselves. Jacobs opposes this viewpoint and tries to garner sympathy for slave women by describing the awful conditions slave women endure, and why those conditions make them unable to fulfill the role of the so-called true woman. Jacobs expresses the goals of her story in the prologue of Incidents when she informs the reader that she desires to arouse the women of the North to a realizing sense of the condition of the 2 millions of women in the South. In realizing that slave women in the South are human beings that face cruel circumstances, Northern women are implored to do something to help improve the plight of their Southern slave women. Second, Jacob hopes that female readers realize that they are being oppressed just like slave women of the South are. The dismantling of the cult of true womanhood would hopefully make readers realize that women don't have to uphold it, and that the expectation of being a true woman is actually holding women back. Thus, Jacob hopes that the rejection of true womanhood would motivate women to advocate for their black counterparts in the South. Harriet Jacobs' story was meant to be a contemporary piece that redefined the role of women in order to gain common ground with the free Northern women, so that they might advocate for Southern slaves. The novel, however, resounds with readers today. Jacob points out the many contradictions and false beliefs 19th century Americans believed about blacks and women. Readers today will notice the parallels between those ideals and the ideas about minorities today. Black women are still undervalued by society, as they were 200 years ago, and women are still subject to the expectations reminiscent of the cult of true womanhood. Thus, Jacob's novel isn't just a contemporary plea for help. Not only that, it is a timeless testament to the inequality embedded within American society.